Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Hi, and welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast hosted by Hema Lomax and me, Lisa Pye. We are sponsored by Corporate Compliance Insights and by the Compliance Podcast Network. You can hear all of our episodes in both of those places. Alejandra Montenegro is my guest today. She is a member at Miller Chevalier and is a chair of their international practice, as well as the practice co-lead for their workplace culture practice. Prior to joining Miller and Chevalier, she was general counsel for the North American and the Latin American division at Gate Group, also known as Gate Gourmet, and an associate at Weil, Gotshal and Manges. If you think that those sound familiar from listening to the podcast, it's because I've worked at both of those places and had that great opportunity of working with Alejandra and getting to know her. Since then, she has won many awards and recognitions from Chambers, Best Lawyers in America, and Latinx, among others. I am so happy that you're here. Thanks, Alejandra, for joining us. Can you tell everyone a bit about you?
Thank you so much, Lisa, for having me. Any opportunity to talk to you is an opportunity I don't pass up. So love to be able to have this time with you.
So I've said a little bit about you. So first, can you tell everybody a bit about what you've been doing when we weren't working together, or maybe even when we were?
Absolutely. So I think you covered the introduction very well, but overall, I am an ethics and compliance investigation lawyer and counsel to companies of all industries, sizes across the globe. Because I'm originally from Nicaragua and Spanish is my first language, I do focus a significant amount of my practice in the Latin American region. Historically, substantively, as I've been focused primarily on anti-corruption investigations and compliance work, more and more, though, my practice is also incorporating general ethics and compliance and workplace conduct issues. So high profile or highly sensitive issues related to harassment and discrimination, applying the same skill set that we use in the white collar world to sensitive investigations and compliance counseling, also applying that to harassment and discrimination matters that are becoming much more compliance focused for companies. And I think we'll probably talk a little bit more about that, but that's generally who I am.
Thanks. And one of my favorite things about you as an attorney and as someone that gives advice is you give very practical advice and solutions. And I wanted to have you talk a little bit about how you do that. And along those lines, as I joke around with you, especially for at being an in-house person, we have our internal pressures, our risks, our resources, our budget, dealing with people. How do you help balance that in a way that you're able to both help your clients and get objectives executed on?
It's a really good question, Lisa. And I think honestly, until you posed it, I don't know that I'd actually thought about the how, because I think of my career almost as having two halves, right? One is where we were first together in private practice at Weil, where I always thought we gave very practical, client-friendly, operational advice. And then I went in-house. And one of my very first memories was our mutual friend, Chris Brown, asked me to do a training for HR professionals at Gate on internal investigation. And I'm like, I was born for this, right? I've been doing this for a long time. So I remember sitting in this conference room and I'm giving just a really sound textbook best practices training on how to conduct an internal investigation. I remember the senior director raised his hands midway, and it was really one of the most humbling moments in my career. And he said, all of that sounds fantastic, but let me tell you about my day. And he began to educate me on the reality of his job and on how so much of what I considered just best practice from an external counsel standpoint didn't really take into account the internal dynamics, and to your point, the resources and the time and the access to information and the ability to bring the type of formality that external counsel, right, would bring to these sorts of matters. And I really just forced me to take a step back and pivot to translate everything that I knew to be true from an external best practice standpoint without sacrificing the integrity of the process but making it fit for his purpose. And similarly, when people would come to me with questions about compliance or other legal concerns, the first step always being, let me understand not just the question that you're asking, but what the operational or business issues are that are underpinning that compliance and legal question. Not to allow them to forum shop and peel back on what the right advice is, but to be able to communicate the advice in a way that makes it actionable and not just give advice that's going to go in the proverbial drawer or will be forgotten because it's something that can't be actioned. And I think part of it, what I've learned throughout my career is that we're not, as compliance lawyers, in the business of risk elimination because that's unrealistic and businesses would have to shut doors. We're in the business of risk mitigation, right? Understanding what companies need to do to mitigate risk, to understand obviously where the line is so that the line is never crossed, and that you help within the parameters of the operations, help build the guardrails that are really in sync with the business. So it just becomes a matter of organic, almost self-implementing advice if the structures are there. So I think that has to take into account risk tolerance and risk magnitude and resources available, and really pleased to see DOJ compliance advice over the years, or not advice, but guidance over the years, really take these factors into account to understand how our clients are mitigating specific risks to them within the reality of their industries and business footprint, and not just taking a very broad-based, non-implementable, not fit for purpose approach to compliance. Very happy.
And being able to use realistic, practical solutions. And that not only is the best way in the approach they said from DOJ and from the others and from us, but it also builds trust with your business people and the relationship, because they know if you say something is actually really a problem, they will believe that, because not everything is a 10-page memo of the legal basis of why everything is a problem.
That's exactly right. And I always would tell my team, and I do this too, right? Let's think a first solution and a second solution is always really, you can come up with two paths forward, right? Let's think about a third or a fourth, right? So we're really pressure testing what is reasonable and actionable. And I take that advice now as an external counsel when I'm working with a company, particularly if it's a client that I haven't worked with for a long time and I'm still getting to know the ins and outs of the business. I really start by having them educate me, right? Not assuming, right, I'm the lawyer, I know everything, I'm just going to tell you what I think you should do, but really helping me understand the totality of their circumstances so that I can give the right advice in a way that is.
I'm going to change the topic a little bit, because since you last joined the podcast, you've done work both as a monitor and helping clients who are working with monitors. Obviously, the last thing I'm going to do is ask about any specifics, but I think there are some lessons that you probably learned being on all those sides that can be really helpful for people in all different parts of those sort of journeys and processes. I think the first question I wanted to ask about is, what do you think is a helpful thing to keep in mind in communicating with monitors, or alternative, if you are the monitor, communicating with those who are trying to do the right thing and figuring it out?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Lisa. And I think the premise there is monitorships are not something that companies want, right? It can be disruptive, it can be costly. Typically, it's viewed as something punitive, which I think is unfortunate. So first and foremost, I think understanding from a company perspective that a monitor can be a very useful resource for your organization, right? The role of the monitor is to independently evaluate whether the systems, controls that you have in place in your compliance program are doing the very thing that you design them to do and that you're representing often, right, to the government that they are doing. So trying to not view monitorships as punitive or adversarial and communicating almost in a way, right, as someone who is there as a resource to help you get it right is the first approach, I think, in communicating. And that means being very open and transparent. These are the things we're doing, and this is the reason why we're doing it. Or these are the things we've considered and we haven't done, and this is the reason why. And I think a theme that emerges between that last question and this one is just the importance of just education. Now, a monitor has to be independent. A monitor doesn't necessarily have to endorse everything that a company represents, but I do think it helps the monitor make better, more effective recommendations and to assess your risk profile more accurately if you have that candid, transparent relationship and communication with them.
I also think that it is beneficial, maybe not as entirely the right word, but if you are an ethics and compliance professional, to be able to have that shows also to a company how serious these things are. And if you go with the never waste a good crisis, there is something, I mean, you don't just get a monitor because you were awesome one day. There are some issues that come to it, but you can take advantage of that and say, look, now we've identified problems. How do we fix them and move forward? I feel like that might be a way to use as a tool, either from the monitor or as someone communicating with them. Is that something that you find is helpful?
That is incredibly helpful. And I think very often the people who are left to work with the monitor and to fix the issues that got us there in the first place typically are not the people who were around the issues. And that leads to another dynamic, right? Because like I'm here and fixing somebody else's mistakes. And
right.
So yes, I think that is a very real situation. I think as monitors, it's also something that needs to be kept in mind is hopefully, while yes, there's independence and the company doing their thing, we have to see that whoever is leading the charge, whether they were there at the time or not, or whether they buy into the monitorship, genuinely and sincerely understands the importance, to your point, right, of the program that they are being called upon to build, and that it's not something that is just being done to check the box, to satisfy the government, right, to satisfy the monitor, to get that certification, because it comes through, regardless of what side of the monitorship you're on. If you're a compliance counsel for a company that's under a monitorship or you're on the monitor side itself, I think just it's important to demonstrate sincere commitment and not just this is something I have to do because the government's making.
Yeah, it strikes me that if you try to check the box when the government's telling you that checking the box is not a good idea, that could cause a lot more problems than one would really hope would happen.
Yeah.
And with that, do you think that there is, with your meetings, I know that there's probably a lot of different thoughts and situations on who to have in meetings with your outside counsel. Is there times to be for an outside counsel to be on their own, to bring certain members of business versus legal, compliance, et cetera? How do you make those decisions and approach the most? I know there's the famous "it depends," but
yeah,
think about when you do that.
I think it is a very real it depends. I think at this point in my career, I've been involved in 3 monitorships in different capacities, right? And thinking about meetings, bifurcating meetings, right? One is when it's the company meeting with the monitor. I think it's really important for companies to have compliance counsel, right? Buffer counsel, even if it's a monitorship even if it's the company that represented in the investigation before the government or a new fresh perspective, right, to come in with compliance advice. It's really important to have that buffer, right? It's called buffer counsel for a reason, to help advise and help manage conversations with the monitor. It can create neutrality, right, in how the company is engaging, particularly if there's going to be pushback or questioning of a monitor's decision, right? I think as buffer counsel, we often play that role of, look, my client's committed to doing A, B, C, and D. Let me explain to you where some of the challenges might be. Let me understand from you, monitor, really what it is you're wanting to drive here. The buffer counsel almost becomes that pivotal interface to be able to have sometimes more candid, more challenging conversations if they happen. And when it comes to the government representation, right, compliance officer, key person, right? Probably at the top of the list if there are places and subject matters that are going to be discussed for them to be present for a variety of reasons. One, nobody can speak to a compliance program in the company better than the people who are in it, developing it and implementing it. It allows the government to see the sincerity and commitment, right, that our clients have. But again, I think there is still there, right, space, obviously, where you may just want your external counsel engagement.
Yeah, I think it's important to keep in mind and probably to be strategic about, but I also find it really interesting on how those decisions are made. And what I'm going to ask you now, it's so interesting because it comes almost full circle to one of the things that you said at the beginning about one of your early meetings at Gate with what was practical versus when someone said, this is what really happened. Is there anything you wish you knew, three involvements with monitorships later, is there anything you wish you knew before you did that now that you could say to that yourself that first day, this is a good lesson?
It pulls from some of the themes that I've made already, right? I think the importance of open dialogue and conversation, right? You, as a company, you've prepared yourself for this moment, right? You've already built your compliance program. You've been working on this for a long time. And I think just helping companies prepare for the message that, okay, that's great, but it might not be enough. And what that means is important because that's hard for internal teams to hear, right? Because most of the time, a lot of work has been done. And there are a lot of things that clients should feel proud about. And I think it's important both from a software counsel perspective and frankly, even from a monitor perspective, just to keep that background and context in mind, assuming we're in a situation where that work has already been done. And the importance of really same thing, right? Understanding the business, understanding the pushes and pulls, understanding the risks so that when you are on a monitor side and you're making recommendations, these are recommendations that are reasonable and implementable. And asking questions to unpack where companies may already be doing something that you can just right size, modify, enhance to mitigate the specific risks that are at play in the monitorship. So I think oftentimes those softer component engagements don't get a lot of light.
Oh, that's really helpful. And it's something to think about. I think you've got the same themes we've been going back and forth, and that obviously are what have made you succeed in-house and now as in private practice. And part of your success in doing that is that now you are one of the co-leads of the Miller's workplace culture practice. And your co-head is with another, she has a great woman in compliance and just a fabulous person, Ann Sultan. Can you tell us a little bit about that practice and how it started? You told me that when I saw you recently, and it really stuck with me and how you started to build it.
Yeah, it is spectacular. And part of what I love about that practice is that I get to work even closer with Ann in that space. So how it started, frankly, a bit organically. I think I came to Miller to focus primarily on more traditionally white-collar work, more traditional anti-corruption investigations and compliance. And that was really the primary focus of the work that I did for the first year or so that I was here. But I did come, as Lisa, with significant experience in using those same skills for workplace misconduct, like harassment, like discrimination. And I'm proud at how our former employer handled those issues and the seriousness with which it treated those matters. They were never viewed, at least in my experience, as, oh, these are just two employee issues. Let's mitigate the litigation risk and let's move on, right? They were really thought through and analyzed in the same way that other compliance risks were evaluated. And having brought that experience on the compliance side and on the investigation side, it became easier for us to be able to pitch that experience to clients and to start taking on more and more of those investigations, which frankly, the firm had already been doing. We're not employment lawyers, so we didn't really have a distinct practice group focus.
Mm-hmm.
You have to figure out how to use chat, how do you package it when you're not an employment lawyer, but you're doing work in a space that has been traditionally viewed as employment law. With the rise of Me Too cases and the realization, finally, for some companies, right, and some organizations and industries, that these issues are critical to business success, employee welfare, the compliance culture overall, it became critically important for us to be able to provide this offering as an actual practice group to our clients. I think overall it's been well received, and being able to help clients manage risk in a way that is so tangible and so directly impacting of employees' health and being and company reputation is frankly, it's an honor and a privilege for us to be trusted with those types of matters because they are real. There are real lives involved.
Yeah.
And it's important for companies to get it right, not just on a case-by-case basis, but to understand, okay, what led us to this point? And what can we do to prevent it? And what can we do to communicate around these issues? And so we use the very same tool when we're talking about corruption, anti-corruption compliance, talking about anti-harassment, anti-discrimination work. We view it as a complete compliance program that uses the same tools and methods that any other aspect of your compliance program should look to.
It's also interesting because from a global standpoint, what workplace culture may mean for one person to another, and the intersections between that and ethics and compliance and ethical decision making is, to me, something that is fascinating. And I think that's the next direction of the field as a whole.
You could not be more right. You could not be more right. And we've seen it manifest itself in cross-border investigations on these issues, right? We're part of what we're unpacking, and that doesn't mean you get to get away with things, right? It just means the way that you approach the issue, you have to take that cultural context. And Miller, we always pride ourselves in, we have language fluency across a whole number of languages. We also have cultural fluency across a whole number of countries, and we bring that sensitivity here as well. And we also bring that in our training of just understanding some practices may be okay. Like for me in Latin America, like how I greet someone is very different when I'm in Latin America than when I greet someone in the US, for example. It's not uncommon for me to greet someone in Latin America with a kiss on the cheek. Right? Here, that's not, you want to shake hands, right?
And potentially, if you're in the Middle East, it may be entirely different.
Exactly. And when we're talking about companies, though, we have to also, for global companies, to your point, just bring sensitivity to the fact that as your company grows, as you become multinational, you become multicultural, and just having that sensitivity of how you interact with colleagues across the globe. So as you're not even inadvertently offending, because even inadvertently offenses can create difficult workplace challenges.
Exactly. And we are talking during Women's History Month. And what do you think as somebody, especially if it's globally or even in your own culture, what can we do as women, and most of our audience is women, although we have some fabulous, great gentlemen who support compliance, but them too. But what can we do to help women across our field and with the workplace cultures that we have?
Oh my God, so much. I think one is just showing up as our genuine, authentic selves.
Yeah.
Serving as formal and informal mentors and role models. I think just there's always been a sense, right? Me too, it's a woman's issue. It's workplace conduct issues or people who only affect women or people in marginalized communities, right? That's not true, right? It affects us all. But I think as women, we can talk about these issues in a very authentic, sincere, and I'm going to generalize, a lot of emotional intelligence to some of these dynamics, and modeling that behavior is critical, I think, to the success of compliance generally and in this particular space.
I think that's some of the best wisdom we can have out there. And I think it's really important too, and I've learned it over the years, about being your authentic self. And you obviously have different components of authentic selves in different areas of life, but being who you are, that's where people will respond, and you can keep your credibility. Happened recently. I was in the UK last week, and I thought two people were having a conversation, and I was asked for some help. It was with IT. And then they looked at me and said, "We're in the middle of something." I said, "That was very American of me, wasn't it?" And and the fact was, they just looked, and they're very polite. But no, I said, "Oh, come on." They're like, "Okay, yes." And just those moments, I think, make us, and when I first met you, which I'd like to say was last week, but just a little longer.
Yeah, we're not going to count years between you and me, Lisa.
Yeah, let's not. let's not. We're just for those listening who won't be seeing us, we're very young. But with that, I also, in our youth, want to say thank you so much for taking the time with me and with our podcast community. And I can't wait to hear you speak again and to see you in person. So on behalf of the Compliance Podcast Network and the Great Women in Compliance, thank you so much, Alejandra.
Thank you for having me, Lisa. Great to see you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.